The 19th of May, 1944. Somewhere in the Pacific, north of Bougainville, midnight. The sea was black and still, the stars above sharp as shattered glass. Aboard the USS England, DE 635, Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton stood on the bridge, eyes narrowed against the dark. He wasn't a man easily shaken, but tonight felt different. He could feel it in his bones, something was out there. Below decks, sonarman third-class Donald Moberly sat alone in the dim red glow of the sonar room. He adjusted his headset, turned a dial, then froze. Contact. Faint. Steady. Closing. He called into the intercom. Pendleton moved fast. Within moments, England came alive. Red lights snapped on. Feet pounded metal grates. Doors slammed shut. Men raced to stations in practiced silence. They'd done this before, but not like this. The enemy was I-16, a Japanese submarine last spotted leaving Truk Lagoon. It was likely on a supply run, loaded with ammunition, rice, and sealed orders, part of Japan's desperate attempt to keep its island garrisons alive. But it had no idea that American codebreakers were watching. And it had no idea that England had been waiting. "Bring us around to 062, Pendleton ordered. The ship turned smoothly, its hull slicing through the dark water like a blade. On most destroyer escorts, this would be the point where they prepared depth charges. Big, blunt, rolling canisters, the same weapons they'd used for years. But Pendleton didn't reach for those. Instead, he looked to something most captains thought was a gimmick. A weapon called the Hedgehog. It didn't look like much 24 short barrels mounted on the bow, angled slightly forward. Each one fired a contact bomb about the size of a fire extinguisher. No explosion unless it hit something. No massive underwater shockwave. No lost sonar contact. It was British. It was new. And it was dismissed by most of the Navy as unreliable. In training, Hedgehog had only hit a submarine 5% of the time. But Pendleton had studied every test. He'd talked to British crews. He believed the weapon wasn't the problem, the tactics were. "Prepare to fire Hedgehog," he said quietly. The bridge crew looked at him, then moved. No questions. Back in the sonar room, Moberly was locked in. Target maintaining depth. Still on bearing 062. Range closing. They were threading a needle in the dark, guiding a 1,400-ton warship onto a submerged target by ear alone. Pendleton waited, then gave the order. Fire. A burst of compressed air. 24 projectiles arced forward in a tight pattern, landing silently in the water ahead. 1 second. 2. Then boom. A distant, sharp crack. Then another. And another. Not the thunder of depth charges. Something cleaner. More precise. "Explosion confirmed," came the voice from sonar. Breaking up sounds detected. Within minutes, oil and debris surfaced, wood fragments, bits of hull, black slicks curling across the waves. I-16 had been caught mid-transit. No evasive turn, no chance to dive, just a clean surgical kill. And England was just getting started. In the mess hall, the crew sat in stunned silence as word passed from man to man. Not because they had killed, they were sailors in wartime, and this was their job, but because they had done it differently. Smarter. Quieter. More efficiently than any ship before them. The Hedgehog had worked, not by accident, but because Pendleton had trusted the science. He had held sonar contact during the attack instead of breaking away to launch depth charges. He had fired forward, not behind. It was bold. It was against standard doctrine. And it had worked. Later that night, Pendleton scribbled a short note into the ship's log. I-16 Sank. Hedgehog confirmed effective. He said nothing more. No speeches. No ceremony. But inside, he knew. The old ways were ending. And England had just started rewriting the rules of submarine warfare. 3 days later, the waters east of New Ireland were calm, almost too calm. The USS England cut across the Pacific swell under a gray morning sky. The smell of salt, oil, and coffee filled the air as sailors prepared for another day of endless patrol. But Pendleton wasn't interested in routine. Word had come down another Japanese sub, RO-106, had been spotted. Radio intercepts traced its movements north from Rabaul. Intelligence said it might rendezvous with another vessel or sneak into the Admiralty Islands. Either way, it was close. Same drill, Pendleton told his crew. We're not guessing. We wait until sonar sings. He meant it. No waste, no noise, no wild drops. Just silence, until the ocean whispered. That afternoon, the whisper came. Sonarman Moberly caught it again. A faint return, moving slow, shallow. Contact. Estimated bearing 049. She's creeping. Pendleton stared out over the bow, calculating. RO 106 wasn't running deep. That meant confidence or desperation. Either way, it was vulnerable. Bring us around. Begin tracking. The hunt began. For 2 hours, England shadowed the contact, never losing it. The sonar ping echoed back steady. It wasn't easy. Currents played tricks. Every shift in depth meant recalculating angles. But Moberly was locked in a human tuning fork. At 1,700 hours, the ship turned directly into attack run position. The water ahead looked no different than any other part of the Pacific. But under that surface, a submarine was trying to vanish. Fire Hedgehog, Pendleton ordered. The launchers hissed. 24 projectiles arced forward. Seconds stretched. Boom, boom, then nothing. A pause, then a low rumble. The bridge crew held their breath. Then sonar called out. Secondary explosions. Strong breakup sounds. Moments later, more debris surfaced. This time, an oil slick so thick it turned the sea tar black. The unmistakable chemical stench of diesel and burned wiring filled the air. Pendleton let out a slow breath. RO 106 was gone. England had just taken down her second submarine in 4 days. The crew gathered on the deck, watching the water. There was no cheering, no backslapping, just quiet pride. The enemy had made it a war of shadows. But now shadows were being hunted. Inside the wardroom, Pendleton sat with his exec and communications officer. Maps were unrolled. Intelligence notes compared. Enemy signals reread. That's when the pattern clicked. Submarines weren't just running supply. They were trying to reinforce defensive lines across the South Pacific. Japan knew it couldn't match U.S. fleets ship for ship anymore. But submarines? Submarines were silent. They were cheap. They could kill anything. Pendleton circled an area on the chart. It was a narrow channel between New Ireland and the Bismarck Sea, deep enough to submerge, tight enough to funnel traffic. If I were trying to slip south to Manus, he said, tapping the map, I'd go here. He radioed Task Group Commander Captain Hamilton Haynes. Request permission to continue patrol along intercept path. Request approved. England altered course immediately. In the next few hours, her lookout scanned every horizon while sonar swept the deep. No one knew what they would find. But Pendleton's gut told him something was coming. This wasn't luck. It was calculation. Signals, routes, habits. Submarines didn't vanish. Randomly, they moved with purpose. At 2,235 hours that night, as the crew rotated into night stations and coffee brewed thick and dark in the galley, sonar chirped again. Contact. Same depth profile as last. Another sub. Another chance. Pendleton didn't flinch. They had a method now. A rhythm. Detect. Track. Close. Fire. He didn't need to tell the men twice. The USS England turned again into the dark, guided by sonar and instinct. This wasn't just about tactics anymore. It was turning into a streak. 2 submarines down, and the next one was already in their sights. Morning came with a pale, cloudless sky and a dead calm sea. The USS England drifted slowly in blue silence, southeast of Manus Island. Below deck, the crew ate breakfast in silence. Powdered eggs, toast, strong black coffee. A few nervous jokes passed between sailors, but most just stared at their trays. They weren't tired, they were alert, focused. Every man aboard England could feel it. The ship wasn't just on a patrol anymore. It was on a mission. At 0730 hours, sonar came alive again. New contact, moderate depth, bearing 140. It was fast, too fast for a supply sub. Pendleton's eyes narrowed. This wasn't a slow-moving transport. This was something hunting, or at the very least, moving with purpose. "Mark target," he ordered. "Maintain distance." As the sonar team tracked the contact, England shadowed at a steady range. Unlike the last two, this one wasn't moving predictably. It zigzagged, varied depth. The Japanese commander below clearly knew the game and was playing it carefully. Pendleton studied the movements, arms folded. "That's a trained skipper. He knows we're here." For 2 hours, the two war machines danced, one above, one below. Finally, the sub slowed. Maybe the commander thought he'd shaken them. Maybe he didn't realize he'd left a sonar trail every step of the way. Pendleton gave the order again. "Attack run, load Hedgehog." The crew moved like clockwork. Forward launcher primed. Calculations set. The launch was smooth. The charges sailed out, fell silent, then, boom, one hit. Then 2 more. The third explosion was sharper, closer, followed by a deep underwater concussion. Then silence. No oil slick. No debris. Just gone. The sonar team listened. Nothing. Pendleton stared out across the water, then nodded slowly. "She's down." That was RO-104, another Imperial Japanese Navy submarine, and the third sunk by England in less than 5 days. The crew barely had time to reset before the next order came in. Radio intercepts confirmed 2 more subs operating in the area. Both had likely departed Truk and were headed south toward Japanese strongholds near Wewak. Task Group Command authorized England to continue search and destroy operations. No other ship in the fleet was having this kind of success. None. Pendleton gathered the senior staff that night in the chart room. "We're not getting lucky," he said flatly. "We're executing. We've got the right tools and the right crew." The men nodded. No bragging. Just quiet understanding. Across the wardroom, Sonar Chief Don Moberly laid out a new map plotting where the previous kills occurred and where radio intercepts pointed next. "If they stick to pattern," he said, pointing at a narrow passage near New Hanover, "we've got a good chance of intercept." Pendleton didn't hesitate. "Adjust course. Run silent." Out on the deck, the sea shimmered with moonlight. A few sailors stood leaning on the rails, whispering about the pace of it all. Some said it felt like destiny, like the ship was built for this. Others didn't say anything. They just stared into the dark, listening for the next ping. Later that night, a lookout spotted a faint plume on the horizon. Then it was gone. Pendleton had a decision to make. Pursue a visual or trust the gear. He chose sonar. Hours passed. Nothing. But just after midnight ping. Contact. Deep. Closing slow. Bearing 228. Another submarine. No one aboard was surprised anymore. Tension. Yes, but no shock. "Run the track," Pendleton ordered. England turned again, her engines humming low and steady. The ocean ahead looked calm, but the crew knew better. This wasn't routine patrol. It was a knife fight in the dark, and the England had found her edge. She wasn't a battleship. She wasn't flashy, but she was fast, smart, and relentless. And somewhere ahead, another submarine was about to learn just how deadly a small destroyer escort could be. The sun hadn't yet cracked the horizon when USS England made her next run. It was just past 0500 hours, and the Pacific lay glass flat. A thin mist clung to the surface, making the water look more like smoke than sea. From the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Pendleton could see no more than a mile in any direction, but he wasn't relying on eyesight. He had something better, sonarman Don Moberly, and a crew that now operated like a single machine. Contact confirmed. Bearing steady. Target holding depth. No course change, came the report from sonar. Pendleton didn't speak right away. He was watching the ocean, his fingers drumming lightly against the metal rail. "Looks like he doesn't know we're here," he finally said. Perfect. This one was different. It wasn't moving evasively. The sub was running slow, shallow, likely cruising toward a supply drop. That kind of overconfidence was rare and fatal. At 0537, England turned into attack formation. No words needed. The men had done this 3 times already. There were no wasted steps. Every man knew his job. Every station was alert. Hedgehog loaded. Firing angle set. Pendleton gave the nod. Fire. The familiar series of thumps rolled down the deck as the 24 mortars launched. The ship's forward momentum carried the projectiles into an arc, raining into the sea ahead in a pattern designed for one thing: to kill submarines. 6 seconds. 7. Then it came. Boom. A clean mid-depth detonation. Then another, and another. A final 4th explosion echoed deeper, the kind that made your ribs vibrate. On the bridge, no one cheered. They waited. Multiple hits, sonar confirmed. Structure noise, she's breaking up. Moments later, oil slicks began to breach the surface. Floating debris followed. Wood splinters. Rubber insulation. A dark, jagged piece of metal hull. The confirmation was clear. The submarine, later identified as RO-116, was gone. England had claimed her 4th kill in 6 days. Pendleton marked the location on the chart, then stood silently for a moment, hands behind his back. He wasn't celebrating. He was calculating. 4 submarines, all within a narrow arc of movement, all following nearly identical transit paths. The Japanese were repeating routes, probably because they had no choice. Their logistics network was collapsing. They were forced to gamble, sending valuable boats on repeat courses, hoping the Allies hadn't figured it out. But England had figured it out. The officers met again in the chart room that afternoon. Radiomen passed on fresh intercepts, decoded Japanese signals, hinting at more submarines moving into the region. Pendleton pointed at the map, fingers sliding across the grid lines. "If this next one's moving from truck to wee-whack, like they say," he said, "we intercept here by late tomorrow." It was a gamble, but Pendleton wasn't guessing. He was tracking a system, and every part of it pointed to one thing: another enemy submarine would be passing through that stretch of sea within 24 hours. England changed course. The crew didn't question it. They trusted him now, fully. 4 kills in 6 days was no fluke. It was discipline. It was precision. And it was war. That evening, the sky turned red with a tropical sunset. Some of the crew stood on the bow, watching in silence. A few smoked. One of the gunners played a harmonica, not loudly, just a slow, drifting tune that matched the ocean breeze. Pendleton stood by himself, eyes on the horizon. He knew they'd been lucky. But luck doesn't string together 4 kills. That came from something else. Trust in his men, in his sonar, and in a British-built weapon most American captains still didn't want on their ships. He walked below deck and checked in with the sonar crew. "Get some rest," he said to Moberly. "We may need fresh ears soon." Moberly just nodded, then turned back to his console. Because somewhere out there, under a mile of quiet water, another submarine was already headed their way. And England would be waiting. The morning of May 26 was quiet. Too quiet for most of the crew aboard USS England. No contact for nearly 2 full days. The tension had shifted from adrenaline to unease. Sailors sharpened tools that didn't need sharpening. Engine room techs double-checked gauges already in the green. Even the cooks were whispering. Lieutenant Commander Pendleton spent most of his time in the chart room, eyes locked on the grid off New Hanover. His theory hadn't changed. Submarine traffic was funneling through this corridor, a choke point in the middle of the Bismarck Sea. Every radio intercept, every previous kill pointed to it. Now they just had to wait. At 1,647 hours, the ocean finally spoke again. "Contact bearing 185. Depth shallow. Target speed 5 knots. Don Moberly's voice crackled through the intercom, calm as ever. But everyone aboard snapped to motion. After 40 hours of silence, the hunt was back on. Pendleton stepped onto the bridge and scanned the empty sea. "He's hugging the coastline," he said, "trying to stay hidden in shelf waters." That was smart, but not smart enough. "Plot an intercept course. Slow ahead. Don't spook him." England turned slightly and crept forward. The ship's vibration changed, tuned down to a low hum. Sailors spoke in hushed tones. Doors were eased shut instead of slammed. Pendleton wanted this one clean. For almost 2 hours, England shadowed the submarine without making a move. Just listening, matching speed, tracking depth. Inside sonar, Moberly adjusted filters and tuned the set by feel. He barely blinked. He's leveling out, holding a course. Pendleton gave the signal. Hedgehog to stand by. The weapon crews moved silently. Ammunition was prepped, tubes aligned. At 1,902, with the sun a dull red smear over the Pacific, Pendleton gave the word. Fire. 24 mortars launched in a ripple, arcing over the bow like stones skipping in silence. No explosions came at first. Then boom. 1 hit, 2. Then a short pause. A deeper, muffled concussion rolled up through the water, unmistakably internal. Solid contact, sonar reported. She's breaking up. As the England circled the site, the wreckage told the rest of the story. Heavy oil, wooden planks, burned paper. An oxygen tank surfaced, slowly spinning. RO-108, another Japanese submarine, had joined the others on the bottom. That made 5. 5 submarines in just 8 days. And now, word was spreading fast. Pendleton received a coded transmission from Captain Hamilton Haynes, commander of the Hunter-Killer Group. Outstanding performance. Request you continue operations in area. Additional enemy subs expected. The message was short, professional, but every officer aboard knew what it meant. England wasn't just a destroyer escort anymore. She was the new standard. In the mess hall, sailors passed around the decoded message. There was pride now, not just in the kills, but in the trust. Fleet Command wasn't just taking notice. They were learning, watching. That night, as the stars came out one by one, Pendleton reviewed the remaining intercepts. 1 sub remained unaccounted for. A big one, row 105, faster than the others. Veteran crew, believed to be operating under radio silence, possibly looping back north to scout Allied positions. Pendleton tapped the map. She'll try to run the corridor like the rest. He knew where she'd pass if she hadn't already. Change course. Move to sector grid 7 to 5. Run sonar sweep every 20 minutes. The crew adjusted without complaint. They were in the rhythm now. The ship barely slept. Watch rotations blurred together. By midnight, England had slipped back into her pattern, slow, quiet, invisible to everything except the one thing that mattered. Sound. And as the moon rose over the Bismarck Sea, the men aboard knew one thing with certainty. There would be a 6th, and England would be ready. Just before sunrise, on the 27th of May 1944, the USS England moved quietly through a narrow patch of water east of Manus Island. The seas were calm again, eerily so. For hours, nothing had stirred except the churn of the screws and the occasional clink of coffee mugs in the wardroom. At 0421 hours, the silence broke. New contact. Bearing 193. Depth unknown, but shallow profile. Reported Don Moberly from sonar. His voice was steady, but everyone aboard could feel it. This was different. The ping had a sharper return, a more defined echo. It wasn't weak or scattered. It was strong, clean. Whoever was down there wasn't just cruising through, they were watching, maybe even hunting. Lieutenant Commander Pendleton moved quickly. The ship came to full readiness in under 2 minutes. Every sailor knew the routine now, but no one treated it like routine. This contact, later confirmed to be RO-105, was unlike the others. It didn't just run, it maneuvered. The Japanese commander below was experienced. He turned sharply after every few minutes. He varied speed, changed depth, used the ocean's thermals to scatter sonar returns. For 2 hours, it was a game of nerves. Every time England tried to close the distance, the sub slipped away, leaving only a shadow trail behind. 3 times, the sonar team reacquired it after brief silence. It was smart, it was fast, and it was still within reach. Pendleton brought the crew into a tight attack circle, a patient, methodical orbit meant to force the sub to act first. Then at 0612 hours, a mistake. The submarine turned broadside, possibly to check bearings or bring torpedo tubes to bear. In doing so, it broke its own sonar camouflage. "Solid contact, holding steady," Moberly called out. Pendleton didn't wait. Hedgehog fire. The mortars launched forward, arcing over calm seas that had suddenly gone quiet again. Every man held his breath. 4 seconds. 5. Boom. One direct hit, then a rolling burst that came from deeper inside the submarine. A low, concussive roar rolled through the hull of England. "She's hit." Sonar confirmed. Major structural collapse. Breaking up. This time, the sea gave back everything. Chunks of deck planking, battery cases, torn pieces of equipment, and a trail of thick black oil that stretched for nearly 300 yards. RO-105 was gone. The 6th submarine in 12 days. On the deck, silence ruled. No fist pumps, no cheers, just stunned, quiet acknowledgement. 6, a sailor finally muttered under his breath. Pendleton stood on the bridge and exhaled slowly. His arms were crossed, jaw tight. He didn't celebrate. He planned. The communications team transmitted coordinates and confirmation to Task Force Command. The response came back fast. Immediate redeployment orders. USS England was to return to base. Fleet intelligence had confirmed no further submarine activity in the immediate area. England had done what no ship in the U.S., Navy or any Navy had ever done. 6 submarines. 12 days. The implications were enormous. Japan had lost 6 boats that it couldn't replace. Dozens of trained crew, valuable supply lines cut, and just as importantly, fear. Japanese command had no idea how England was doing it. Was it a new weapon, a new ship, a new tactic? The answer, of course, was all 3. But most of all, it was people. Pendleton, Moberly, every crewman aboard who trusted something unproven and executed it perfectly, over and over again. Later that evening, Pendleton met with his officers in the wardroom one last time before departure. "None of this was luck," he said. "Every man on this ship earned it. And what we've done here, it's going to change how this war is fought." He was right. In the weeks that followed, 7 other destroyer escorts were retrofitted with Hedgehog systems and trained using England's attack patterns. Submarine doctrine shifted. Commands rewrote their playbooks. And back in the Atlantic, where German U-boats still prowled, a quiet revolution was about to begin. But for now, the sea was still again, and the USS England turned home. Le 1 juin 1944, Purvis Bay Naval Base, Solomon Islands. USS England glided into harbor just after sunrise, her hull streaked with salt and oil from nearly 2 relentless weeks at sea. She didn't look like a record breaker. No new paint, no fancy flags. Just a lean, Buckley-class destroyer escort built for convoy duty, not glory. But everyone at the dock knew. Before the gangplank even touched steel, officers from Pacific Fleet Intelligence were waiting with clipboards in hand. Shore patrol cleared space around the pier. Sailors from nearby vessels leaned over rails, watching in disbelief. Word had spread a rumor at first, then confirmation from the Office of Naval Operations. 6 submarine, 12 days. 1 ship. Inside the wardroom, Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton sat across from 2 fleet intelligence officers, both fresh from Pearl Harbor. They weren't there for ceremony. They were there to learn exactly how England had done what no other warship had. Pendleton walked them through it. The contact reports, the sonar team's adjustments, the specific firing angles, the decision not to drop depth charges even when doctrine said to. He laid out a clear fact. Hedgehog worked not because of brute force, but because it let them keep sonar contact right through the attack. That changed everything. One of the officers scribbled furiously. "Did you ever consider switching back to conventional charges?" Pendleton didn't flinch. Not once. The room fell silent for a beat. Then the other officer nodded. "Your tactics were recommending fleet-wide adoption. Immediate." That afternoon, Pendleton stood before his crew. Not on a stage, not at attention. Just in front of the forward guns, oil stains on his sleeves, salt crust on his boots. "I don't have medals for you," he began. "That's not why we're here." He paused, looking each man in the eye. "But make no mistake, The entire U.S. Navy knows your names now. They know what this ship did, and they'll be using what you learned to finish this war. No cheering, just a few firm nods, a slow round of applause from the engine gang. That was all. Because the men aboard England weren't in it for recognition. They were in it to win. Below deck, the sonar team was already reviewing logs, analyzing wave patterns, adjusting gain settings. They weren't resting on success. They were preparing for the next fight. Meanwhile, in Pearl Harbor, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz received the after-action report with a single-word headline: flawless. Nimitz signed the bottom in red pencil and added a note in the margin: deploy lessons immediately. Atlantic Command to be briefed. The ripple effect started within days. Destroyer escorts across the Pacific were rearmed with Hedgehogs. Training manuals were rewritten, sonar protocols updated. A new doctrine began to take shape, not built on depth charges and blind bombing runs, but on precision, patience, contact. And it all started with England. On the same dock where they'd first tied up, a petty officer from a nearby destroyer leaned over and shouted to one of England's gunners, "Hey, you guys ever miss?" The gunner just smiled. Not lately. Down the pier, a few sailors from a transport ship began calling England the submarine killer. The name stuck. But Pendleton didn't let it change the mission. He submitted one final request to the chain of command: don't pull England from frontline duty. There's more work to do, he wrote. And my crew's ready. By the end of June, the ship would return to sea. There were still submarines out there. And now, they were the ones running. By mid-June 1944, the name England was making its way through every level of the U.S. Navy, not in headlines, but in hushed conversations between officers, hurried briefings at fleet commands, and scribbled notes in revised anti-submarine warfare manuals. Across both oceans, commanders were asking the same question: what did they do differently? The answer was deceptively simple. They trusted their sonar, stayed patient, and used a weapon nobody else believed in. But what mattered most? They rewrote the method. Instructors at Pearl Harbor's Fleet Sonar School began tearing up lesson plans. New simulation drills were drafted. Crews were trained to hold contact during attack runs, not break off for depth charge drops. Hedgehog fire patterns were analyzed, diagrams redrawn, attack angles refined based on England's logbooks. Pendleton's after-action reports weren't just read, they were studied like doctrine. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, U.S. destroyer escorts supporting convoy lanes between New York and Liverpool received urgent orders. Every ship with a Hedgehog system was now expected to implement England-style tracking patterns. Some commanders pushed back. They had been fighting U-boats their way since '42. But by July, results began to speak for themselves. Hedgehog success rates jumped from 5% to nearly 17%. In one case, a destroyer escort near Iceland, the USS Buckley, successfully disabled U-66 using a forward Hedgehog attack almost identical to England's maneuvers. In the South Atlantic, Task Group 21.12 began scoring hits on German submarines that had been haunting the convoy lanes for months. And it wasn't just about the kills, it was about psychology. Enemy submarines now had something new to fear. The old cat-and-mouse game had shifted. Depth charges made noise, sure, but submarines could escape the chaos. Hedgehogs were quiet until they weren't. A single contact, a single sonar lock, and 24 bombs were in the water before the enemy even knew they'd been detected. No warning, no bubble trail, just silence, then impact. Back in the Pacific, Japanese submarine command struggled to respond. Intelligence analysts in Tokyo knew 6 boats had vanished in 12 days. They had no survivors, no distress calls. Just silence. Families notified. Unit records closed. Some commanders believed England was part of a larger task group, that no single ship could deliver that kind of precision kill streak. Others thought it was new American technology. Rumors spread of deep sound weapons and invisible mines. None of them knew that the real weapon was doctrine sharpened through discipline, trust, and a small ship's willingness to try something new. In July, England was officially reassigned to convoy protection duty around the Marianas. But the story of her 12-day streak continued to echo. Fleet Admiral Nimitz personally noted the accomplishment in a report to Washington. England exemplifies what modern anti-submarine warfare must become: sonar precision, forward attack capability, and tactical confidence. She has proven it can be done. The Navy Department circulated that line across every major naval base in the Pacific. And for the men aboard England, the recognition came not as awards or medals, though many would receive them, but in a new sense of purpose. They weren't just sailors on a destroyer escort anymore. They were the proof. The crew grew tighter. New sailors arriving aboard asked the older hands for their insights on Hedgehog reload speed, sonar sweep timing, bearing correction math. Everything was practical. Nothing was theoretical anymore. Pendleton continued refining the tactics, sketching updates in the margins of official logs, correcting firing angles by hand, and even suggesting improvements to sonar signal dampening in choppy conditions. By August, some of his notes would influence the design of the Mark 15 sonar interface used on newer escorts. The war rolled on more convoys, more patrols, more submarines to chase. But what England had done in May wasn't just a chapter in the war. It was a turning point, a moment when one small ship showed the entire U.S. Navy and its enemies that precision and trust in innovation could reshape the battlefield. And they hadn't fired a single depth charge. As the months passed, the Pacific War escalated. Battleships pounded island fortresses. Carriers launched hundreds of planes a day. And the U.S. Navy moved forward, island by island, mile by mile, toward Japan. But in the shadow of that vast machinery, the name England kept coming up, not in speeches, but in the background chatter of captains and chiefs. What did they do that we didn't? Back at sea, USS England returned to patrol in the South Pacific. No fanfare, no welcome flotilla, just another line in the operations schedule. She was back where she belonged, moving quietly through deep water with her sonar sweeping in slow, patient arcs. To the crew, it didn't matter if anyone else noticed. They had their rhythm, they had their reputation, and they had each other. So what made England different? It wasn't speed. She was fast for an escort, but not exceptional. It wasn't firepower. Hedgehogs didn't look like much, just a strange-looking rack of stubby barrels on the bow. It wasn't even the tech. It was discipline. The crew trained harder than most. They drilled without being asked. Fire teams practiced Hedgehog reloads blindfolded. Sonarmen like Don Moberly could distinguish between a whale and a submarine turning at 1/10 speed. And above all, they trusted each other. Pendleton never shouted. He didn't have to. He explained, then expected. If he said hold course, they held it. If he said fire, they fired. No guessing. No second guessing. During lulls in patrols, young sailors were mentored. Listen to the sea, Moberly would say, not just the sonar. The sea tells you when something's wrong. Ed. Gunners cleaned barrels that hadn't been fired in weeks. Lookouts practiced spotting periscope wakes in glass-calm water. They didn't just prepare for contact. They lived as if it could happen any second. And that mindset changed everything. Pendleton submitted a memo to Fleet Command in July 1944 that broke with Navy tradition. In it, he recommended that Hedgehog crews be selected not just for mechanical skill, but for calm under pressure. He argued sonar operators should train alongside gunnery crews to build trust, not just skill. That memo, tucked into a binder at Comsopac, would go on to shape how future destroyer escort crews were built, pairing calm sonar listeners with sharp, intuitive gunners. But back aboard England, they didn't talk about that. They talked about getting it right every time. That summer, the ship was assigned to protect convoys moving through the Solomon chain. They didn't encounter another submarine during those runs, but they trained as if they would. Other ships started asking to rotate officers through England temporarily just to observe. The crew noticed, but didn't show off. They just kept doing what they'd done before anyone was watching. One sailor, Seaman First Class Paul York, said it best during a mess table conversation with an officer from another escort. "Sir, you can read every manual you want, but out here, it's just you, your sonar, and whether you believe it enough to fire when it counts." In that sentence was the whole story. Belief. In the gear. In the crew. In a way of fighting that most thought wouldn't work. And in the end, that quiet belief turned into results no one could ignore. By September, 7 destroyer escorts had successfully sunk submarines using England-style tactics. The average sonar to impact time dropped by 40%. Contact loss rates plummeted. But only one ship could say they did it 6 times in 12 days. Only one crew knew what that felt like. Not as a flash of luck, but as the result of work. Hard, constant, unseen work. And while the world moved on, battles won, cities bombed, treaties signed, the men of England carried something else with them. A quiet, unshakable knowledge that they had done something few would ever match. Not because they were asked to, but because they believed they could. By the end of 1944, the Pacific War had changed shape. The U.S. Navy was pushing west toward the Philippines. Carrier groups dominated the skies. Submarines hunted Japanese merchant fleets with impunity. The tide had turned, but long before that shift became headline news, a single destroyer escort had already drawn a line beneath the sea. USS England. 6 confirmed submarine kills in 12 days. It wasn't just a statistic, it was a statement. And though her mission changed, the legend followed her. After returning from convoy duty in the Marianas, England was reassigned to picket and screening roles for the fast carrier task forces. She guarded flat tops, launching strikes against Iwo Jima and Okinawa. She refueled at sea, rescued downed pilots, intercepted enemy radio signals. Her days of submarine hunting were behind her, but her legacy was already moving faster than she was. Rear Admiral Forrest Sherman called her the most outstanding anti-submarine ship in the history of the United States Navy. Fleet Admiral Nimitz declared, "There'll always be an England in the United States Navy." That promise would be kept 3 times over. Each future USS England bore the name with pride, honoring a crew that never asked for credit, never chased glory, and never missed. But for those original sailors, what mattered wasn't the records or the headlines. It was the memory of those 12 days. May 19 to the 31st of May 1944. The tension of quiet hours waiting on sonar. The calm voice of Moberly announcing contact again and again. The feel of the deck vibrating beneath their boots as Hedgehogs fired forward into the deep. The silence that followed. Then the unmistakable sound, boom, a hollow, distant concussion echoing back through the hull like a heartbeat. That was the rhythm of their war. In late 1945, as the guns of World War II finally fell silent, the crew of England was scattered, some to new ships, some to civilian life. The ship itself was eventually decommissioned, sold for scrap in the post-war drawdown. No ceremony marked the end. Just a quiet final log entry and a few worn boots on the pier. But ask any man who served aboard her and they'd tell you exactly where they were on May 19. They'd tell you how the fog hung low off Bougainville that night, how the water was flat as glass, how the first explosion from I-16 came with no warning, and how, for a moment, they all realized they were part of something no one would believe until it was written down in the logs. 6 submarines, 12 days, 1 crew, 1 ship. They didn't change the course of the war by themselves, but they showed the Navy what was possible. They proved that new ideas, when executed with precision and belief, could reshape the battlefield. And they left behind a legacy far deeper than steel or statistics. It echoed across sonar waves. It whispered through doctrine handbooks. It lived in every future crew that trained harder, listened sharper, and believed in the impossible because a tiny ship named England had already done it.